Chapter 1. The Waters of Harrogate. The Harrogate Spa and Hydro had been receiving the unwell, the merely anxious, and those who wished for a graceful excuse to do nothing for 11 days since 1887. It stood on a limestone shelf above the Dove Valley in Derbyshire, its Victorian bulk softened by 30 years of ivy, and the general mellowing that descends on institutions once they have survived 2 wars and a change of ownership. The terrace looked south. On clear mornings the view extended beyond the dale to a long blue ridge that might, in certain lights, have been the edge of the world. Miss Marple had been sent here by her nephew Raymond, who had observed over Christmas that she looked tired, and who did not, she suspected, mean that at all. What he meant was that she had been asking rather pointed questions about a young woman named Celia, who had appeared 3 times at Raymond's cottage in November under circumstances that were never quite satisfactorily explained. The spa was a way of removing her from the vicinity. Raymond was not unaffectionate. He was simply transparent, which was, Miss Marple had long since concluded, the condition of most people who thought of themselves as subtle. She arrived on a Tuesday in April, when the hills were still brown at their crowns, and the new grass in the valley was the particular acid green that exists only for a fortnight each year. A porter named Thomas carried her 2 cases up the shallow steps with the practiced detachment of a man who has learned not to judge luggage, and Miss Marple stood for a moment in the entrance hall and took it all in. The hall smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and something beneath both, something faintly medicinal, not unpleasant, the olfactory residue of generations of therapeutic intention. A fire burned in a wide stone grate despite the mildness of the day. To her left, a staircase of good oak descended from the upper floors with a dignity that stopped just short of grandeur. A glass case displayed the spa's water analysis certificate framed in walnut, dated 1923 and not updated since. Beside the reception desk, a tall vase held last week's daffodils, which had reached the stage of elegance particular to flowers just past their best. The register lay open on the desk. Miss Marple, waiting for the young woman behind it to locate her reservation, found herself reading it as naturally as she would read a train timetable or the notice board out of a parish church. It was a habit, not nosiness, or rather she had ceased to distinguish between the two. Room 14, Mr. and Mrs. H. Fotherby, Birmingham. Room 9, Miss Constance Ellery, address in Shropshire. Room 7, Mr. and Mrs. Lionel Ashford, Northamptonshire. Room 3, Dr. and Mrs. Beaumont Park, London W1. She noticed, because she noticed most things, that the register was the old ledger type, cloth-bound, the pages ruled in pale green, and that where a previous guest had made a booking for room 7, visible in the upper portion of a page now partly obscured by the desk blotter, someone had written Edmund rather than Lionel. The ink was the same color, black, slightly faded. The date could not be seen, but the handwriting was identical to the current entry below it, and the address was the same Northamptonshire address. The only difference was the name. Miss Marple said nothing about this. She accepted her key for room 11, thanked the receptionist, and followed Thomas up the stairs, pulling on her gloves as she went. At dinner that evening she observed the Ashfords. Lionel Ashford was a large man who had the look of someone who had been larger still in earlier life and who carried the diminishment with private resentment. His face was florid in a way that suggested blood pressure rather than good health. His eyes, pale blue and quite shrewd, moved around the dining room with the automatic assessing habit of a barrister, which he had apparently been. He ate steadily and without particular pleasure. He spoke rarely to his wife. Miriam Ashford was 60 or thereabouts, thin in the fine-boned way that becomes increasingly distinguished with age. Her hair was white, cut well, worn without apology. She held herself with the straight-backed composure of a woman who had learned composure as a discipline rather than received it as a gift. Her hands, resting on the table between courses, were very still. On the fourth finger of her right hand, not the left, she wore a ring with a small oval, amethyst that she touched occasionally with her thumb, briefly, as though confirming it was still there. On the table beside her handbag sat a needlework case in ivory-colored leather, monogrammed M.A., the initials pressed in gold that had worn to a suggestion. She had apparently brought it to dinner with no intention of using it, and had simply not wished to leave it in her room. Miss Marple filed this away without comment, even to herself. The other guests she assessed with the pleasant, systematic thoroughness she applied to new situations. Dr. and Mrs. Beaumont Park were a London couple in their 50s. He a retired GP with a hearing aid he refused to acknowledge. She a woman who had clearly spent 30 years being interesting on his behalf, and had recently, perhaps this year, decided to stop. Miss Constance Ellery was younger than her Shropshire address suggested. Late 30s, fair, with the look of someone who had not slept well for some time. The Fotherbys from Birmingham were uncomplicated in the way that contented people are. There was also a table near the window occupied by a man dining alone. Dr. Pavel Krenich, as Miss Marple later learned, the locum physician retained by the spa, while their permanent doctor was recovering from a knee replacement. He was perhaps 45, slight, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and the alert, watchful face of someone who had learned in some earlier life to read rooms quickly. He ate slowly. He did not look at his phone. He watched the room with an attentiveness that Miss Marple recognized, as one recognizes a method rather than a person, as something like her own. She slept well that night. The Derbyshire air had that particular quality she associated with limestone country, clean and faintly mineral, as though the hills were still breathing out their geological history. In the morning she brought her knitting to the terrace and watched the valley, and waited to see what the week would offer. The Harrogate regime was not onerous. Guests were encouraged, a word that did not entirely conceal the mild coercion beneath it, to take the waters at 9, to walk for an hour before lunch, to submit to whatever therapeutic procedure had been assigned to them by the spa's director, a brisk Yorkshire woman called Mrs. Pendlewick, and to retire at a reasonable hour. The assumption was that persons seeking rest would not require entertaining, and by and large the assumption was correct. Miss Marple took the waters with the equanimity she brought to most unpleasant necessities. The mineral spring at Harrogate produced water of a sulphurous character that was held, by those who had drunk it for decades, to be beneficial to the liver, the joints, and something called general vitality that no one ever precisely defined. It tasted, Miss Marple thought, exactly like what it was. Old water from a very deep place, carrying news from geological periods that had nothing to do with the present century. She drank her glass each morning in the pump room, alongside whoever else happened to be there, and in this way she accumulated information at the pleasant passive rate of a plant receiving light. Lionel Ashford, she observed, drank his water standing and quickly, as though it were medicine to be got over with rather than a ritual to be undergone. He was here. It emerged from a conversation she allowed herself to overhear on the Wednesday morning, on Dr. Krenich's recommendation. Not a personal recommendation. Lionel had apparently been referred to the spa by his cardiologist in London, and Krenich was simply the physician on site. They had not met before this week. The heart, Lionel said to the Fotherby husband, Howard, who had asked with the general amiable inquiry of spa guests, gives us warnings that we are obliged to attend to. I have attended to mine, reluctantly.
Quite right, said Howard Fotherby, who did not appear to follow his own advice.
My wife insisted,
Lionel added.
in a tone that made this sound like a modest virtue on his part, rather than an instruction he had been given. Miriam, 3 feet away, refilling her glass, gave no indication of having heard this. She finished her water, set the glass down with the precise movement of someone who always sets things down rather than merely placing them, and went to stand at the window that looked out over the valley. She stayed there for rather a long time. Her hands were in her cardigan pockets. Miss Marple noticed that the right hand moved once, in the gesture of someone touching a ring they are not wearing. Constance Ellery, arriving late for the waters, dropped her glass and apologized to everyone within range in the excessive way that people do when they are already apologizing for something else. Dr. Krennic materialized at her elbow with the smooth, reflexive competence of a physician used to being the person who steps forward, retrieved the glass, and told her the floor was perfectly all right, which was not precisely what she had been distressed about. "Thank you," Constance said. Her voice was thin. She looked at him as though he were a solid object she had not expected to be there. "You slept badly again," he said. It was not quite a question. "Is it obvious?" "Only professionally." He was already moving away, glass in hand, toward the sideboard. "Come and see me this afternoon if it continues. I have a preparation that may help." Miss Marple watched this exchange with mild interest. It had the quality of a conversation that had already occurred several times in a slightly different form. Constance Ellery watched him go with an expression that involved more than gratitude for a retrieved glass, and then appeared to become aware of this and arranged her face into something more neutral. On Thursday, Lionel Ashford complained of fatigue during his afternoon walk and returned early. His color, Miss Marple noted at dinner, was different. Not worse, precisely, but altered. He was slower, he ate less. He held his water glass with both hands briefly, as though he needed the anchor. Dr. Krennic, who had been speaking quietly with Mrs. Pendlewick near the door to the dining room, glanced at Lionel with the professional neutrality. That is itself a form of attention. Mrs. Pendlewick said something. Krennic nodded once and did not look again. At the next table, Miriam Ashford cut her lamb into pieces she did not eat and watched the hills go dark. Through the window, the ivory needlework case was in her hands, unopened, her thumb tracing the monogrammed initials. M.A. Miriam Ashford. M.A. Also, Miss Marple thought without attaching any significance to it, the initials of Miriam, whoever she had been, before she was Ashford. Which was, she reflected, how women's monograms tended to work. The maiden initial absorbed into the married one, the old self carried forward as a footnote. She picked up her own knitting and counted her stitches and thought about nothing in particular, which was to say she thought about everything at once. It was not difficult to arrange. Miss Marple had been experiencing, quite genuinely, a stiffness in her left wrist that she attributed to 3 years of knitting more ambitious projects than her joints strictly approved of. She presented herself at the small consulting room on the ground floor on Friday morning with her knitting bag and her most harmless expression, and Dr. Krennic, who had been reading a medical journal with the focused pleasure of a man who rarely has uninterrupted time for such things, put it down and gave her his full attention. This, she noticed, was a quality he possessed. He did not merely look at a patient. He looked at them as though the looking were itself a form of diagnosis, which she supposed it was. "The wrist," he said, examining it with hands that were careful and warm and entirely certain of what they were doing. "You've been using it quite strenuously." "I've been knitting rather a complicated pattern," Miss Marple said. "A fair isle for my nephew's birthday. I may have underestimated my own enthusiasm. You'll want to rest it." He rotated her wrist gently. "And perhaps tell me when you first noticed the restriction." They spoke about the wrist for a while, and then, as Miss Marple had been waiting for it to do, The conversation moved sideways in the natural way of conversations when one party is genuinely curious, and the other is skilled at appearing not to direct anything at all. "You've been here only a few weeks," she said. "Not quite a question. Since March. The permanent physician, Dr. Hollis, had his surgery in February. He'll be back in June, they think." Krennic wrapped her wrist in a light support bandage with the neat economical movements of someone for whom the procedure was below the level of conscious attention. "I do locum work generally. I prefer the variety." "Variety suits some people very well," Miss Marple agreed. "I have a friend in St. Mary Mead. Well, she moved away some years ago, who was a nurse and who found settled practice quite difficult after a certain point. She'd done district nursing all over Worcestershire and couldn't quite adjust to seeing the same 6 families week after week. She said it made you start to see patterns where there weren't any." "And did it?" "She thought so." "I was never entirely sure she was wrong." Krennic tied off the bandage and sat back. "The wrist will be better in a few days if you're careful. Try not to flex it more than necessary. Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "seemed rather tired at dinner last night. I noticed he came in from his walk early. Nothing serious, I hope?" A pause. Brief and quite controlled, but there. Guests often experience fatigue in the first few days. The regime can be tiring until the body adjusts. The waters affect different constitutions differently. Of course. She tucked her knitting bag under her arm and rose with the slight effortfulness she had learned long ago to deploy judiciously. "He seemed quite well when they arrived on Tuesday." "He did," said Krennic, in a tone that closed the subject. She thanked him and left. In the corridor, she passed Miriam Ashford coming in the other direction. Not heading for Krennic's room, simply walking, the ivory case clasped loosely in one hand at her side. They had not spoken yet beyond the general exchange of pleasantness that spa living enforced, and Miriam gave her a nod of the purely formal sort, the greeting of someone who does not want to begin a conversation that will be expected to continue. Miss Marple smiled back and walked on. What she had noticed, and she had noticed it because she noticed such things, was the faint smell that accompanied Miriam, not perfume. Something slightly green, slightly bitter, residing in the fabric of her cardigan rather than on her skin. It might have been a soap with plant-based ingredients. It might have been the residue of someone who had been working in a garden recently, pressing certain leaves. It was the smell, Miss Marple thought of foxglove. Not a suspicious observation in itself. Many people grew foxgloves. They were beautiful and popular, and very common in cottage gardens. The smell from a cardigan worn while doing any kind of gardening might linger for days. She went up to her room and sat by the window with her knitting, and watched the daffodils on the terrace bend and right themselves in the April wind. And she thought about the register entry she had seen on her first day. And she thought about a wrist she had not been entirely honest about. And she thought about a man whose veins might or might not be entirely cooperative. And she listened very carefully to what the thinking was not quite telling her yet. The friendship, if it could be called that, between Miss Marple and Constance Ellery began in the way such things do at spas, through proximity and the peculiar equality of shared mild suffering. They had been assigned adjacent chairs in the solarium for their afternoon sessions, and the combination of warm light and enforced inactivity produced, over 2 days, the conditions for actual conversation. Constance was 37, a solicitor's clerk from Shrewsbury, unmarried, here on medical leave for nervous exhaustion, a phrase she used with the slightly ashamed air of someone who does not entirely believe in their own illness. She was precise in her language, Miss Marple observed, in the way of people trained to record rather than to interpret. She said what she had seen, not what she thought about it. He was shouting, she said on the Saturday afternoon, when she had been talking for some time about the journey up from Shrewsbury and the state of the second class compartments on the Midlands line. The transition was not abrupt. Something had loosened in her in the warm light. In the corridor on Thursday night, Mr. Ashford. I heard him from my room. Who was he speaking to? His wife. I couldn't hear what she said. She spoke very quietly. He was the one who... Constance stopped. I shouldn't be telling you this. You aren't telling me anything, Miss Marple said peacefully. You're simply thinking out loud. It can be a useful exercise. After a moment, he said something like, if you tell anyone, we lose everything. Or words to that effect. I wasn't trying to listen. The walls at the end of the corridor are quite thin. Miss Marple let the silence develop for a moment. People say such things in anxiety, she offered. Financial worries follow people even to places like this. I had a neighbor once. He used the word Edmund, Constance said. I heard it clearly. He said, Edmund would never have let it come to this. Or perhaps Edmund didn't need to worry about it. Something involving Edmund. A brother. Perhaps. Constance turned her face back toward the glass ceiling of the solarium, where April clouds moved at their own pace. I felt rather sorry for her, Mrs. Ashford. She didn't raise her voice at all. And then the corridor was quiet, and I heard a door close, just quietly. And that was worse, somehow, than the shouting. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about the guest register and the name Edmund in older ink. And she was thinking about how a person might sustain a deception for 2 decades, and what the weight of that would feel like at 60. And she was thinking about the way Miriam Ashford touched the spot on her right hand where a different ring had once been. Did you mention this to anyone? She asked. No, it's not my business. No, Miss Marple agreed. It isn't, rather. She picked up her knitting. And I expect the morning will be better. These things usually are. Constance looked at her with the slight uncertainty of someone who is not sure whether they have just been comforted or dismissed, and Miss Marple smiled at her in the placid way that answered neither concern, and went on with her Fair Isle. That evening at dinner, Lionel Ashford did not come down, Mrs. Pendlewick announced, with the particular bright professional serenity of someone trained to present crises as inconveniences, that Mr. Ashford was unwell and was resting in his room, and that Dr. Krennick had attended him, and that everything was quite all right. This information traveled around the dining room in the way information does in small enclosed communities, quietly and completely, and within 6 minutes. Miss Marple ate her soup. Miriam Ashford came to dinner alone and sat at the table by the window. She ordered the fish. She poured her water with the steady hand of a woman who has been doing the thing she is most afraid of for so long that her body has forgotten there is anything to be afraid of. The ivory case was in her cardigan pocket. The outline of it was visible. Across the room, Dr. Krennick watched her. He did so only once, and then his attention moved on, and he ate his dinner with the quiet composure of a man who has processed something privately and reached a conclusion that has not yet required action. Miss Marple looked at both of them and thought about the word pattern and about what her nurse acquaintance had said, that you start to see patterns where there aren't any. And she tried very carefully to determine whether what she was seeing was a pattern or whether it was only her mind, that industrious and occasionally overreaching machine, imposing a shape on a collection of unrelated and quite innocent facts. She was not entirely sure. That, in her experience, was usually significant. Lionel Ashford died at 20 minutes past 6 on Sunday morning. Miss Marple heard the commotion from her room at 6:45. Footsteps of an urgency that establishments like Harrogate did not normally permit. Voices in the corridor rendered indistinct by 2 doors and 40 feet of Victorian corridor. She dressed with the briskness of someone who had learned that catastrophe does not wait for one to finish with one's hair, and she sat in the chair by her window and waited for the shape of the morning to become clearer. The police arrived at 8:30. A detective inspector from the Derbyshire force, a constable, and in due course a police surgeon, Mrs. Pendlewick, moved through the hotel with the expression of a woman who has prepared for most eventualities, but had given this one only theoretical attention. The guests assembled by degrees in the drawing-room off the main hall, summoned by word of mouth rather than official instruction, which meant they arrived already talking. The detective inspector was a man named Halford, early 40s, with the deliberate patience of someone who has learned that the first hour of a sudden death is mostly about allowing people to exhaust their initial versions of events. He was not, Miss Marple noted, a fool. He let the Fotherbys finish their account of having heard nothing, thanked them with a courtliness that was genuine rather than professional, and then asked, without urgency, whether anyone had seen Mr. Ashford in the 24 hours before his death. The room produced its various contributions. He had been seen at breakfast on Saturday. Fragile, someone said. No, tired, someone else corrected. No, not there at all, came a third version. He had not come to dinner. He had Dr. Beaumont Park offered this quietly and usefully. Appeared briefly on the terrace at about 4 in the afternoon in a dressing gown and returned. Inside within a few minutes. Miriam Ashford sat in the corner armchair closest to the door with her hands in her lap and answered every question she was asked in a voice of composed and absolute grief that was, Miss Marple thought, entirely real. The grief was not performed. It was something she was holding as one holds a heavy object, not dramatically, not with collapse, but with the full weight of it pressing down through her arms. What she said, that her husband had not been feeling well since Thursday, that she had spoken with Dr. Krennick about it twice, that Lionel had refused to be more formally examined, that she had brought him a cup of tea at 10 the previous night. He had been awake, reading, and that when she looked in on him at 6 he was. She stopped here, briefly, that it was apparent very quickly that he had been gone for some time. What she did not say, anything about Edmund, anything about Thursday night, anything about what had been said in the corridor. Inspector Halford took notes. He was thorough and kind and not theatrical about it. Dr. Krennick, when his turn came, was precise. He had seen Lionel on Thursday afternoon and again Friday morning. The patient had reported fatigue, some nausea, mild visual disturbance. He had suspected. Here, Krennick paused in the careful way of a physician who suspects something but does not wish to produce a theory he cannot yet support. He had suspected the digitalis the patient took for his cardiac condition might require adjustment. He had recommended rest and planned to take a blood sample on Monday. He had not anticipated, and here the pause was slightly longer. He had not anticipated this. You thought the digitalis levels were wrong, Halford said. I thought they might warrant checking. The symptoms were consistent with it. They were also consistent with general fatigue and an adjustment to the waters. But you were concerned enough to have planned a test. A precautionary test. Yes. Halford wrote this down. Miss Marple watched him do it and noticed that he underlined one word. She was too far away to see which. Later, when the drawing-room had thinned and the constable was taking statements from the remaining guests individually in the library, Miss Marple found herself briefly alongside Krennick in the corridor outside. A sad morning, she said. Yes. He looked at the carpet. He had the expression of a doctor who is doing sums in his head that have not yet balanced. I imagine, Miss Marple said gently, that the thing that will trouble you is having planned the blood test for Monday. He looked at her. Yes, he said, after a moment more quietly, that is the thing. I have a nephew, she said, who is a writer, and he always says that the timing of information is more interesting than the information itself. When you know a thing and when you act on it. Those are separate questions, aren't they? Krennic regarded her for rather a long moment. Are you asking me something, Miss Marple? Not at all, she said pleasantly. I am simply making conversation. One does at these moments. He nodded, not entirely convinced, and walked on. The police moved through room 7 on Sunday afternoon with the methodical courtesy of official procedure. Inspector Halford was not the type to produce conclusions before he had evidence, and he was also not the type to share his progress with interested elderly women who happened to be on the premises. He was, however, too intelligent to be rude to such women, which meant he listened when Miss Marple said she wondered if anyone had thought to look in the drawer of the bedside table on the left side of the bed rather than the right. Halford looked at her. Why the left? Mr. Ashford was right-handed, Miss Marple said, but he held his water glass with both hands, which I noticed particularly on Thursday evening, which suggests the right hand was perhaps less reliable than it had been, which suggests that he may have been using the left side of the bed rather than the right in the latter part of the week and had put things within easier reach accordingly. Halford sent the constable back into room 7. The constable found in the left bedside drawer a glass of water, 3/4 full, Lionel Ashford's reading glasses, a small notebook, and a folded letter in an envelope addressed in handwriting that was not Lionel's. Halford read the letter in the corridor. He did not share it with Miss Marple, but she was standing a sufficient distance away, not unreasonably close, merely not unreasonably far, to observe that it was handwritten on cream stationery, that it ran to 2 sides of a single sheet, and that when Halford finished reading it, his expression was of a man who has found the second corner piece of a puzzle that is, as a result, considerably larger than he had assumed. He folded it and put it in an evidence bag and went to find Miriam Ashford. That conversation took place in the library with the door closed. Miss Marple did not hear it. She sat in the drawing room with her knitting and listened to the hotel settle around her. The diminished sounds of a place that has contracted around an absence, and she thought about what the letter might contain. What she suspected it contained was information about the trust. She had been thinking about the register entry for 2 days. Edmund Ashford, same address, same handwriting, many years prior. And she had been thinking about the way Lionel had said on Wednesday morning, Edmund would never have let it come to this, which was what Constance had heard, or close to it. And she had been thinking about the way Miriam had touched the bare finger of her right hand as though checking for a ring, and she had found herself arriving by slow triangulation at a picture whose proportions were still unclear, but whose subject was beginning to resolve. Edmund Ashford, she suspected, was dead, had been dead for many years, and Lionel, his brother, had been receiving something, income, property, a trust distribution, in Edmund's name, using some arrangement made possible by a legal document, a forged signature, a cooperative solicitor, the distance between Northamptonshire and wherever the trust was administered. 22 years, long enough for anyone who might have questioned it to have retired, died, or lost interest. Long enough for it to have become simply how things were. And Miriam had known. From the beginning or from some point along the way, she had known, and she had kept the secret, and the secret had produced that very particular kind of interior weathering that comes not from one single terrible thing, but from decades of sustained complicity. The question, the only question that mattered, and that Miss Marple had not yet resolved, was whether Lionel Ashford's death was murder. Because it might not be. A man with a documented heart condition on a digitalis prescription, placed under the stress of whatever threat had precipitated the Thursday night argument. Attending a spa that served mineral waters of an unusual composition, such a man might reasonably die, of natural causes, of his own history catching up with him. Or he might have been helped along. She knitted 3 more rows and looked at the hills and admitted to herself that she did not yet know, which was unsatisfying, and then reminded herself that not knowing yet was not the same as not knowing, and went on with her work. The letter, Miss Marple learned, not from Halford, who told her nothing, but from Constance Ellery, who had overheard Mrs. Pendlewick telling the kitchen supervisor, who had told Thomas the porter, was from a firm of solicitors in London. It had been sent to Lionel Ashford at Harrogate, forwarded from his Northamptonshire address. It informed him that the trust of Edmund Ashford, deceased 1972, was subject to a review by the Charity Commission following an anonymous complaint received in February, and that a meeting was requested with the trustees within 30 days. This was the shape of it. The specific language Miss Marple did not know, but she knew enough. Edmund had died. Lionel had thereafter been receiving income from a trust established in Edmund's name, a trust that, like most private trusts of that era, had been administered at a distance, and with the gentlemanly assumption of honesty that characterized such arrangements before the era of closer regulatory scrutiny. No one had looked carefully. There had been no reason to, and now someone, the anonymous complaint, had given them a reason. The question of who had made the complaint was, she thought, the more interesting question than the question of whether Lionel was murdered. The 2 questions were related, but they were not the same question, and she had a feeling. The particular feeling she associated with the moment in A Piece of Fair Isle, when the pattern began to resolve, that the complaint was the mechanism of the whole thing, and that whoever had sent it had set this death in motion, whether or not they had planned to. She went to speak to Dr. Krennick. She found him in the solarium, which was empty at this hour. He was standing at the glass wall that looked south, his hands behind his back, with the posture of a man who has been standing still long enough that he has stopped noticing he is doing it. "I wonder," Miss Marple said from the doorway, "whether you might help me with something." He turned. He did not look surprised to see her. "If I can. When you examined Mr. Ashford on Friday morning," she said, settling herself in one of the wicker chairs as though this were entirely a social call, "you mentioned to Inspector Halford that you planned to take a blood sample on Monday. Had you? I am only asking from medical curiosity. Please do tell me if it's impertinent. Had you had occasion to take blood from him previously? A routine thing, perhaps, on admission? We do a basic admission panel for cardiac patients," Krennick said carefully. "Yes, on Tuesday when he arrived. And that panel would show Bisome levels, electrolytes, digitalis concentration in the blood. He was watching her, among other things. So you would have had a comparison point, yes, and the levels on Friday, which you did not test, but which the symptoms suggested to you, would have been higher than the Tuesday baseline." A pause. "Significantly higher, yes, in my clinical judgment. If I had," he stopped. Miss Marple waited. "If I had acted on Friday rather than planning for Monday," he said, in the tone of a man stating a fact about himself that he has already fully reckoned with, "the outcome might have been different. I considered it. I concluded I was perhaps overcautious. I was wrong to conclude that. Or," Miss Marple said gently, "someone ensured that the increase in levels happened between Friday and Saturday night, when you were no longer in a position to intervene. The silence that followed was of a different quality. You're saying it was administered after Friday. I'm saying the possibility is worth considering. If the post-mortem finds digitalis at a level substantially higher than what you assessed on Friday, and if that level is inconsistent with his normal prescription, then either his prescription was at fault, which seems unlikely given that he had been stable on it, or someone gave him more. Not all at once, perhaps, over several days, beginning perhaps Wednesday or Thursday, starting from a level that would produce fatigue and nausea and visual disturbance and building. Krennic sat down. This, she noted, was not something he had been expecting to do. He was not a man who sat abruptly. The soluble form, he said slowly, as though thinking aloud despite himself, can be introduced into liquids. Water, tea, in very small amounts it is. He stopped. She brought him tea on Thursday night. She told Halford she brought him tea. She told Halford several things, Miss Marple said. All of them true, I should think. Mrs. Ashford does not strike me as a woman who lies readily. I think she has been telling the truth. I think the truth, in this case, is sufficient to accommodate a great deal. Krennic looked at her for a long moment. Should you be telling me this? I am not telling you anything, Miss Marple said, standing. I am simply thinking out loud. I believe I mentioned that it can be a useful exercise. She was wrong about one thing, and it mattered. She had assumed, she permitted herself the admission because it was important to be honest about, the shape of one's errors. She had assumed that the motive was concealment of the trust fraud, that Miriam had killed Lionel, or had decided that his death was acceptable, because the solicitor's letter had made the exposure of their 22-year deception imminent, and that exposure would destroy not only their finances but their son's legal career. She had established, through the sort of general conversation about families that guests at spas engage in freely, that the Ashfords had a son, James, a barrister in his early 30s, at a good set of chambers. A son who almost certainly did not know that his father's income had been sustained by fraud. This motive was real. She was not wrong about it, but she had also assumed that Miriam was acting alone, that Lionel was the victim, and in this she had made the error that her method sometimes produced. She had found a template. She knew a woman in St. Mary Mead once, a Mrs. Hennessy, who had borne 22 years of a husband's financial chicanery before one morning simply not bearing it any more, and she had applied the template too fully, too early, before she had all of the data. It was Constance Ellery who provided the correction, though she did not know she was doing so. They were on the terrace on Monday afternoon. The hills were clear for once, the light brittle and clean, and Constance was speaking in the slightly disconnected way of someone who has been conducting an interior argument for some time, and has finally decided that speaking aloud is less exhausting. I've remembered something else, she said, about Thursday night, when I heard the argument. Miss Marple waited. It wasn't. I said he was shouting. He was. But there was another voice too. Earlier, I mean, before the shouting. A quieter voice, a man's voice, from the corridor. I thought it was a guest passing. But now I think Lionel, was on the telephone. The things I heard him say weren't answers to his wife. They were answers to someone else. What did you hear? Constance pressed her lips together. He said, You have no evidence. And then a minute later, If you do that, I will tell them about the girl. And then a pause, quite long, and then, If you've already sent it, then we are finished. And after that is when his wife came in, or he called for her, and the argument began. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. The girl, she said. Yes, I don't know what that means. Nor do I, said Miss Marple, which was not entirely true. She was thinking about Pavel Krennic, about his watchfulness, his careful composure, his particular attention to the Ashford table in the dining room. She was thinking about the locum posting, March, unexpectedly available, and about a man who preferred variety, who had learned to read rooms quickly, who had arrived at this particular spa at this particular moment. And she was thinking about the word girl, and about what a man like Lionel Ashford might use as leverage against a man like Pavel Krennic. and about whether Krennic had sent the anonymous complaint to the Charity Commission. She was not, now, at all certain that Miriam had administered the digitalis. The post-mortem would tell them a great deal. Halford was a careful man and he would follow the evidence. But Miss Marple found herself, sitting in the April light with her hands in her lap, in the position she found most genuinely uncomfortable. Having two theories, neither of them complete, and insufficient data to adjudicate between them. She had a feeling, she had learned to treat this feeling with respect, that the answer was already present in what she had observed, that she had seen the right things, that it was a matter of arrangement, of putting the pieces in the right order, and that she was one piece short. One piece or one question she had not yet asked. She looked out at the hills and tried to work out what she did not yet know. She asked to see Miriam Ashford on Monday evening. This was not an official request. She had no standing to make official requests, and Inspector Halford, who was pleasant and thorough, and had by now received the preliminary post-mortem results, digitalis toxicity, levels 4 times the therapeutic range, inconsistent with the prescribed dose taken as directed, had not asked for her assistance, and had not indicated that it would be welcome. She went simply as a guest of the hotel, going to express her condolences to a recently widowed woman, which was a thing she entirely meant. Miriam received her in room 7, which was perhaps surprising. She had not asked to be moved to another room, and Miss Marple thought this was significant in a way she had not yet classified. The room had been cleared and examined and returned to hotel normality, but it was still the room where Lionel had died, and Miriam sat at the small writing desk by the window in it, with the particular quality of someone who is enduring a place rather than inhabiting it. She had aged in a day. Not dramatically, she was still composed, still the straight back and the careful hands, but the texture of her face had changed in the way that grief changes it, a kind of loosening of the connective tissue of expression. "I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said, sitting in the armchair across from the desk. "I simply wanted to say that I am very sorry." "Thank you." The voice was steady. "And to return this." Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and produced the ivory needlework case. Miriam went very still. "I found it on the terrace," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "on Sunday morning quite early, before the commotion. I expect it dropped from your pocket when you went out for air." "I thought you might prefer to have it back quietly." Miriam's eyes moved from the case to Miss Marple's face. This took some time. "Thank you," she said again. "I didn't open it," Miss Marple said. "That wouldn't have been right. I simply held it and thought about you and felt sorry. These situations are very difficult. The decisions one must make when one is trying to protect someone." She watched Miriam Ashford absorb this sentence. "You're protecting your son," Miss Marple said. "That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? Not yourself, not even really your husband, or not anymore, James." The hands in Miriam's lap did not move. The right hand touched briefly and without apparent awareness the finger where no ring was.
"I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued, in the gentle conversational tone she used for the most serious things,
"about how a woman comes to a decision like the one I believe you've made. It isn't usually a single moment, is it? It's more like a long, quiet accumulation. 22 years is a very long time to know something that cannot be spoken, and then to discover that the speaking is about to be forced. My son," Miriam said. Her voice, for the first time, was not steady. "He doesn't know. He has never known. He is a good man, an honest man. He would be disbarred. He would." She stopped. She looked out the window. "He worked so hard. Lionel made him work hard. Lionel was proud of him. That was genuine. Whatever else, Lionel was genuinely proud." Miss Marple said nothing. "I thought," Miriam said very quietly, "that if Lionel were not alive, the investigation would. that there would be no one to prosecute, that a dead man's trust fraud is a different matter than a living one's. That James would be, I thought. That James might be spared, Miss Marple said. Yes, I think you were partly right about that, though I'm not sure you were entirely right. Miriam looked at her. Her eyes were dry, which was worse than if they had not been. There's something you haven't told the inspector, Miss Marple said, about the telephone call on Thursday night, before the argument. A silence. Who called Lionel on Thursday evening, Mrs. Ashford? Another silence, and then, I don't know his name. I know of him. He called Lionel's mobile phone. I heard only Lionel's end of the conversation. She paused. He was the one who sent the complaint. Lionel had done something to him. Years ago. Something involving a young woman. Lionel used that to keep him quiet for several years. And then the man decided he no longer cared what Lionel threatened him with, and sent the complaint anyway. Yes, Miss Marple considered this. And Lionel, when he came to you after the call, he said we were going to lose everything, that I had to. She stopped. He told me what I needed to do. He had a plan. He said if he became very ill, if he were in hospital, the meeting could be postponed. He had done it before, years ago. A heart scare, genuine that time. He thought he could do it again. He asked me. He told me the dose. He said it would produce convincing symptoms without. Her voice broke entirely on the last words. A clean, precise break, like a bone. He said it would be safe, that it would be enough to get them 4 or 5 months. He researched it. He told me the exact amount. Miss Marple sat very still. He was wrong, Miriam said. The room was quiet for a long time. He calculated the dose himself, Miriam said. He was a barrister, not a doctor. He had heart disease. He didn't know. He didn't account for. She pressed her hand flat on the desk. I did what he asked me to do. I followed his instructions exactly. Ah, said Miss Marple, very softly. This was the piece she had been missing. She went to Halford the following morning. She found him in the library, which had been commandeered as a working room, its bookshelves of Victorian fiction providing a backdrop of complete indifference to the proceedings. He was reviewing papers. A constable sat at a side table with a laptop. The morning light came in cold and lateral through the north window. I hope, he said, looking up, that you are here to tell me something useful. I am here to suggest that the question of who killed Lionel Ashford may have a more complicated answer than either of the two most obvious answers. He put down his pen. Mrs. Ashford administered the digitalis. She did. And you're going to tell me she didn't intend to kill him. I'm going to tell you that she intended to do what her husband asked her to do, and that what her husband asked her to do was not to kill him, that the death was the result of a miscalculation, and that the person who made the miscalculation was the person who died. Halford looked at her for a long moment. He had, she thought, already considered this possibility. He was the kind of detective who considered all possibilities and then looked for the evidence that would help him discard them. That would require Ashford to have been party to his own poisoning. Not his own poisoning, his own illness. There's a distinction, and he did not survive it. She should have told me this on Sunday. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. She should have. She will. I believe she understands that now. But I wanted you to know the shape of it before she did, because I think the shape matters, and because I think there is another question that has not yet been fully addressed. She sat down, which she had not been invited to do. The man who telephoned Lionel on Thursday evening. Halford's eyes sharpened slightly. Lionel appears to have been blackmailing someone. A man who knew about the trust fraud, or had discovered it independently, using information about a girl, Mrs. Ashford believes this man sent the anonymous complaint to the Charity Commission. He had, presumably, decided that whatever Lionel held over him was worth less to him than the satisfaction of exposure. Blackmail, Halford said. For several years, apparently. I don't know the man's name, but I think," she paused, choosing her words with care, "I think it is possible that you may find him closer to this building than you currently expect."
Halford looked at his papers, at the notes he had taken on Dr. Pavel Krenik's statement.
At the word he had underlined. "The locum physician," he said. "I am speculating," Miss Marple said carefully. "I have no evidence. I noticed that he arrived here in March, at a time when the spa had an unexpected vacancy. I noticed that he watches the Ashford table with more than professional attentiveness. I noticed," she paused again, "that on my first morning, when I saw him administer the mineral supplement to Mr. Ashford as part of the admission protocol, he remarked, apparently to himself, that the patient's veins were unusually cooperative. It struck me as an odd remark for a routine procedure. Later, I understood what might make it odd. If a person had already introduced something into a patient's system, something that dilated the veins would indeed be more cooperative than normal." The room was quiet. "That would mean," Halford said slowly, "that Krenik was also dosing Ashford earlier in the week, possibly from Tuesday. Small amounts, not lethal, not yet. Designed, perhaps, to worsen Ashford's condition in a way that looked like his existing heart disease progressing. And then Mrs. Ashford, following her husband's own instructions, added more, neither of them knowing the other was doing the same thing." She paused. Lionel calculated a dose that he believed to be safe based on a healthy baseline. He did not know his baseline had already been compromised. Halford was silent for some time. Two people independently dosing the same man. Yes, and neither of them intending. She stopped. Well, one of them not intending to kill him. And the other? Miss Marple looked at the bookshelves. Trollope and Hardy and a complete set of Kipling, mostly unread. "I think that is for you to determine," she said. "I would not wish to characterize Dr. Krenik's intentions. I would simply note that a man who has been blackmailed for several years, who decides to act against his blackmailer by other means, and who then takes a position at the spa where his blackmailer is staying. Such a man has made a sequence of decisions that are difficult to characterize as improvised." Halford arrested Pavel Krenik at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. He did not do so on Miss Marple's speculation, which would not have been sufficient. He did so on the basis of the admission blood work. The panel Krenik had taken from Lionel Ashford on Tuesday morning and had described in his statement as showing baseline levels within expected parameters. Halford had the sample retested. The digitalis concentration in the Tuesday sample was already 3 times the prescribed therapeutic level. Either Lionel Ashford had been taking far more than his prescribed dose before he arrived at Harrogate, which his London cardiologist, when contacted, denied emphatically, or someone had introduced digitalis into his system on or before Tuesday morning, before Krenik took the blood. The sample itself had been the evidence. The sample Krenik had taken and then described as normal. He had, Miss Marple reflected, been very nearly right to have confidence in his plan. The sample would have been destroyed in due course. The post-mortem would have shown elevated digitalis, consistent with a patient who had been managing his own dose carelessly. The wife had cooperated unwittingly. The Charity Commission complaint was separate, civil, not criminal. Lionel would have died. Krenik would have moved on to another locum position, as he always did. The matter would have closed. Constance Ellery had been the error. The telephone call overheard through thin walls, the reference to the girl. That had been a thread, and the thread had been there for Miss Marple to pull. She thought about Krenik after he was taken away. She thought about the shape of his life as she had inferred it. A doctor with good hands and a watchful intelligence who had done something years ago with a young woman and had been paying for it since in ways that were not formal, but were perhaps more corrosive than the formal kind. A man who had arrived at this quiet limestone shelf above the Derbyshire Valley and looked at Lionel Ashford across a dining room and made a set of cold decisions that he had lived with during the intervening weeks with an apparent equanimity that she found, in retrospect, the most frightening thing about him. Not the act, the equanimity. She thought about Miriam, too, who had spent that same Tuesday evening knitting in the common room with her hands steady and her ivory case in her pocket, and the knowledge of what she had done, was doing, already embedded in her. The thing that both of them had in common, she thought, was that they had acted in response to Lionel Ashford, that he had been, in both cases, the originating pressure, that he was, in the most uncomfortably literal sense, the author of his own death. This was not a comfortable conclusion. It was not satisfying in the way that a solution ought to be satisfying. It left too many real people in real trouble. Miriam facing, at minimum, a serious charge. James Ashford facing the exposure of his father's fraud and the probable disruption of his career. Constance Ellery, who would be required to give testimony about something she had overheard through a thin wall and who had come here for rest. Halford, who was conscientious and not unkind, had spoken to the Crown Prosecution Service by Tuesday evening. The precise charge against Miriam would depend on how closely the pathologist could determine that Krennic's dosing, rather than Miriam's addition, had been the proximate cause of death. This was uncertain. It might remain uncertain. The law, Miss Marple reflected, was less comfortable with uncertainty than it felt it ought to be. On Tuesday evening she sat on the terrace in her coat. The April evening had turned cold, and the hills were beginning to disappear into a gray that might have been cloud or might have been the failing light. And she knitted, and she thought about Lionel Ashford's letter to his wife that had been found among his papers. It had been written months ago, the handwriting clearly predating any deterioration. It set out the plan, the dose, the expected symptoms, the expected duration. It contained, in its careful, lawyerly language, everything required for his own accidental self-destruction. He had been so certain of his own competence, she thought, as she sometimes did, about the question of justice. Not the legal question, which was Halford's, but the other question, the one that resisted clean answers. Lionel Ashford had been a man who had defrauded a trust for 22 years, had used the proceeds to support a life and a career and a son, had blackmailed a man for several years to protect himself, and had in the end deployed his wife in a scheme designed to protect him further. He had died as a result. Was that terrible? Probably. Was it simple? Absolutely not. She finished 2 more rows and counted them and thought about Mrs. Hennessy from St. Mary Mead, who had in the end done something quite different from what Miss Marple had originally applied her to, and she thought about the danger of templates applied prematurely. And she thought about how the most frightening thing about human wickedness was, not its unpredictability, but its patience. She left Harrogate on Friday as planned. Thomas carried her cases down with the same practiced equanimity, and she waited in the entrance hall for the car she had ordered, and she looked at the register, which now had additional names: policeman, a pathologist, someone from the Charity Commission, layered over the original quiet list of the unwell and the merely anxious. Constance Ellery was in the hall, waiting for a taxi. She was going back to Shrewsbury. Her leave had been extended, which was at least one thing that had resolved in the direction of kindness. "Are you all right?" Miss Marple asked. "I think so." Constance adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "I keep thinking I should have said something sooner. About what I heard. You said something when you remembered it." "Yes, but—" She stopped. "I mean, I should have realized it mattered. We only realize things matter once we understand the shape they're part of, Miss Marple said. Before that, they're just observations. The best you can do is keep observing and wait for the shape to emerge. That's all anyone can do, really. Constance looked at her. You make it sound like there's a pattern to everything. There isn't, Miss Marple said. That's rather the difficulty. Patterns emerge and then they don't hold, and then they emerge differently. One has to stay flexible. It's rather tiring, frankly. Constance smiled, briefly and genuinely, for the first time since Miss Marple had known her. The taxi came. They said goodbye. Miriam Ashford had been taken to stay with her son James in London. Halford had told Miss Marple this on Wednesday with the neutral delivery of a man, conveying facts rather than assessments, and she had appreciated his restraint. The charges, he had said, were still being considered. Complicated was the word he had used more than once, and Miss Marple had agreed that it was. The Crown Prosecution Service would want a clear narrative, and the case did not have one. What it had was several people applying pressure to a single point, and the point collapsing, and no one knowing quite who had done the final damage. She thought about James Ashford. She had seen photographs of him in the room, his call to the bar, a family Christmas, a holiday somewhere warm. He had his mother's fine-boned look and his father's pale blue eyes, and the particular expression of a young man who has been assured that the world is orderly and is about to discover that it isn't. She felt the particular sorrow she always felt for the people adjacent to catastrophe, not the ones who caused it, not the ones who suffered most directly, but the ones in whose lives the damage spread sideways, quiet and permanent. Dr. Krennic had not said anything beyond his name in formal interview, which was sensible, given his situation. He had sat in the chair across from Halford with the watchful composure intact, and his hands folded and his face entirely steady, and Miss Marple, who had not been present, but had heard about it from Halford in one of the inspector's occasional unguarded moments, thought, there goes a man who has been preparing for this contingency for quite some time. Not this specific contingency, but the general one. The moment of being known. Her car came. She got in. The driver, a young man from the village below, said, "Did you enjoy your stay then?" "Parts of it," Miss Marple said honestly. "The waters are supposed to be very good for you. I believe they are."
She looked out the window as they descended the limestone shelf toward the valley floor. The hills were clear this morning,
the ridge to the south visible in clean detail against a sky that had finally decided to be blue. The daffodils were past their best everywhere. The new grass in the valley was still that particular acid green. She thought about the Fair Isle she had not finished, and would take out again at home. She thought about Raymond and his friend Celia, and whether she would ask further questions or allow that particular matter to develop on its own, which was sometimes the wiser approach. She thought about the word pattern and about its opposite, which was not randomness, but was perhaps simply life proceeding at its actual speed, which was faster than pattern and more indifferent to it. She thought about Miriam Ashford's hands very still on the desk in room 7, about the ivory case, about 22 years. There was a question she had not asked Miriam, and now would not ask, because Halford had the case and it was not hers. The question was whether, if Lionel had not made his miscalculation about the dose, Miriam would have given it to him at all, whether the moment of compliance had required a private bargain, a decision made in some interior room that would never be available for evidence, in which the potential outcome had been fully considered. She did not know. She found she did not know, and that she was not certain she wanted to. Some things she had decided long ago were not hers to determine. Guilt of a certain kind, the kind that lives in the silence between what was intended and what was known, between what was done and what was permitted. That guilt was not adjudicated by courts and it was not adjudicated by her. It simply lived with the person who carried it. And some people carried it with extraordinary composure for a very long time, and the composure was neither proof of absence nor proof of presence. It was simply the thing they had developed for the purpose. The car entered the valley. Above her, the Harrogate Spa and Hydro receded into its shelf of limestone, its Victorian bulk already acquiring the muffled quality of things that have been left behind. The ivy on its walls was beginning, she noticed, to show the first young green of the season. She settled her knitting bag on her lap and looked ahead at the road.